Welcome to Varn Vlog. And as you can see, my office is getting packed up. We're moving locations soon. But we're going to finish our discussion of Neel's series, A Quarter Pound of Flesh. After all, if the spirit of the 18th and 19th century was Bonaparte on horseback enforcing nationalism on Europe and inadvertently by World War I and World War II, the world, then perhaps today we can talk about Bonaparte on a burger bun, because that too has infected the world. I have been to McDonald's in Africa, in East Asia. They're everywhere, man. But beyond that, maybe the most pristine image of our time was Trump standing in front a bunch of burgers. Now, normally I find the burger imagery condescending of Americans, the kind of things a European would send up while complaining about us and talking about how bad our ice is, why they love their Interpol. But I do think that there's an important portion to the burger talk, and Neel gets to it because it says something about the entire supply chain and political economic realities of our world, particularly when you start thinking about political economy in terms of calories. In the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, Neel wrote two essays, A Quarter Pound of Flesh Part 1 and A Quarter Pound of Flesh Part 2 for the Brooklyn Rail. And we have covered in two parts, A Quarter Pound of Flesh Part 1, but now we're going to cover Part 2. Let's get straight to it. Neel is an incredibly literary political economic writer, which is a rare thing these days. So I probably will read longer passages without commentary because they're well written. Let's get into the text. Quarter Pound of Flesh, Part 2 by Neel, published in February 2025. At the end of my shift, my legs are bruised and my muscles burn like embers glowing in the ash of a dying fire. Freezing mist coats the windshield as I drive through the massive port complex. Loading cranes loom in the distance under towering spotlights, and razor wire glitters at the top of the fences wrapped around each other's container yard, ensuring that the residents of a nearby village cannot pilfer the billions of dollars of commodities flowing like a river to the delta of the port. But it also gives you the sense that you are traversing a sprawling prison complex. Asterisk. So many things look like prison complexes. It's almost like architects read Foucault's comments on Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, but decided to use it as a blueprint. Back to the text. A space designed to hold in some eldritch animus seething through the massive commodities, and through you trapped there with it, a force passing from the grid and the burger into your body, its carcass. There it is, in fact, a literal prison within the figurative one, since the region's largest migrant detention center, the Northwest Detention Center, run by the notorious GEO Group, is lodged within the bowels of the port, its borders patrolled by Homeland Security agents in blacked-out SUVs. That's probably only gotten worse since this was written. Inside, detainees have launched regular hunger strikes in protest of the facility's abysmal conditions, as well as lawsuits alleging beatings and threats on the part of the guards. Several years ago, an elderly anarchist committed suicide by launching a doomed one-man assault on the facility, where he was promptly shot to death by the police. Something that I don't hear commented on that much these days. I pass the prison in darkness. It is sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., and by the time I park in my own light industrial neighborhood just beyond the border of the port, several neighboring cars will have had their windows smashed out and interiors plundered of anything remotely stealable. If a car is left parked too long, the battery will be mined from the engine and the tires harvested like bark stripped from a tree. Some vehicles are set on fire for no apparent reason. Their burned out husks left on the street for weeks, stripped bare of any salvageable metals before they are finally towed away by the city. In fact, The neighborhood is something of a magnet for arsons. In addition to the campfires lit for warmth and regular cook stove accidents that wipe out villages on certain blazes of poisonous smoke, billowing from black from burning plastics. That happens here, but from different reasons. It's usually from wildfires here that catch on neighborhoods, and you see the black smoke from burning plastics. So great. Anyway, back to this. Random fires are often ignited in service of some more inscrutable purpose. Every few nights, the smell will wake me up, and I'll have to check that our building is not ablaze. Once, just on such a night, I saw one of the pyromancers from my window, a shadowy figure robed in a mildewed blankets, gathering trash from the street side and arranging it into a little circular pyre. The fire wasn't placed up against any building, and it was too small to be used for heat. It instead seemed to be more like a maddening ritual, perhaps conducted to appease some enigmatic entity that only those living out in the cold have eyes to see. In the morning, all that was left was a perfect circle of gray ash, hosed off the sidewalk by some of the artists in the neighboring ceramic studio. Thankfully, no one's ever tried to light my truck on fire, but the catalytic converter was long gone. Both door locks were gouged out, and the ignition was periodically smashed open by clueless thieves. It is simply another tax on the poor, paying out your insurance deductible around 60 hamburgers every other month on top of rent. And if your vehicle survives the night, the city will be sure to come around in the morning and place little canary yellow tickets on any car that still has a windshield. You cannot escape your punishment. Phil, you write like Thomas Ligotti. Anyway, back to this. The battle and the burger. Obviously, as a currency of survival, the burger has become the immediate focal point of the class struggle. And in so doing, it has taken on a contradictory character, serving as both the source of subsistence needed by all workers and the specter of scarcity forcing us to work for others in the first place. Nor is this anything new. As early as 1844, Marx explained that the worker becomes a servant of his object first, and that he receives an object of labor, i.e., he receives work, and second, and that he receives means of subsistence. In other words, the burger is not simply a form of subsistence, it represents the wedging of market mandates into a metabolic gap that separates people from the means of survival. As a result, we are forced into a hostage situation in which we have no choice but to rely on the very thing, the dictatorship of prophets and its priests, that is taking us hostage in the first place. And we've designed our whole cities to make ourselves dependent on these kind of commodities, not just the hamburger, which I talked about before in a private patrons only episode when I was asked to talk about, struggles with obesity in America, social policy, and my own dealing with it. If you watch the show for a long time, you see my face get fatter and thinner, fatter and thinner. But what you may not know about me is I used to be really, really big, a lot bigger than I am now. And it was a long struggle, mostly that I saw by leaving the country, which most people cannot do. Imagine the vast surplus of goods that will contribute to make in any given day. Since there is no real scarcity of goods nor any technical issue in distributing them to those in need, the limit to doing so is essentially social. Yep. Embedded in the relations of domination that make some lords over others. In our society, this domination is expressed in the rule of property. And that is precisely why, if you fail to provide your tithe of burgers to one of your several lords, the robed cleric at the country courthouse will declare your existence unlawful, and the soldiers of the local fiefdom will be sent to kick down your door and drag you outside, where you will be forced to live, caveat generat lapunium, wearing the head of the wolf, in the language of medieval jurisprudence, an anarchic name for those pushed outside the legal convention who can be deprived of access to society and freely punished with no means of recompense. A villain. Yeah, that's what I meant. In other words, our social order is not enforced so much by the overt threat of violent punishment, although it, of course, hovers in the background, as by the implicit threat of violent exclusion, which is normally the threat in most societies, not just capitalist ones. If you don't want to deal with the guilt of killing someone, but you kind of want to kill someone, you exile them. The withholding of the burger. Since we literally have no choice but to depend on the burger for survival, any struggle against this order is also a struggle within and against the burger itself. In this struggle, however, politics taking two equally premature forms. First, those that stress only the against in this equation tend towards an academic or artistic idealism, which, though often correct in theory, proves vacuous in practice. Cough, cough, DSA, right politics, cough, cough. And therefore tends to retreat further into its own idealism by policing language, polemicizing on the internet, and encouraging scandals of their minor points of exegesis, and exacting a rigorous lifestyle protocols that approximate a strict moral requirements, sort of like a monkdom. I mean, this was one of the points that I actually agree with Mark Fisher and the Vampire Castle essay on. But really, it is better talked about in the terms of Nick Land's cathedral because it is kind of a cathedral. Often the theoretical realities are very real, but how we deal with them is so removed from any material politics as to be, well, pathetic and not even LARPing. At best, this idealism results in a reduction of politics to merely an academic pursuit. At worst, it metastasizes into suicidal adventurism, obsessed with the mythic language of militants for its own sake and completely disconnected from mass politics. And man, are we seeing a lot of this right now in both regular left and ultra left worlds. But the second error is even worse. Those who stress only within progressively sacrifice any strategy for remaking the social world at all, each of their meager victories giving way to an endless chain of ever worsening compromises conducted for the sake of real gains or simply development. I also agree with this. This is, the average Jacobin article, if we're quite honest. This later error is, in other words, a form of anti-communism invoked again and again in its historic suppression of revolutionary politics. And although these two seem to be fundamentally different errors, they are in fact symbiotic, each reinforcing the other as a natural counterpoint and both rejecting the balance of the within and against necessary to any truly partisan project. Perhaps the most insulting part of the warehouse job was that, shortly before I started training, the union had won what the progressive press referred to as a historic victory, resulting in 2.5 hamburgers an hour pay rate I received for the nights of backbreaking labor. Union leadership characterized this as the most lucrative contract in labor history, renting more money, higher wages than ever before, and a huge economic gains. The company's CEO, who makes roughly 436 times the median worker salary, seemed equally satisfying, characterizing it as a win-win-win deal secured by an industry-leading pay and benefits while retaining the flexibility to stay competitive, serve our customers, and keep our business strong. And when you hear that means that oppositional bargaining is out the window, right? And it has been for a while. Meanwhile, all of this was taking place in the wake of a long-fought victories by grassroots reform factions within the major unions, including our own, and amidst of a more general increase in support for unionization, especially amongst the youth, asterisk, even though they don't join unions because they don't have access to do it, and often the only union growth is in new unions who often don't have the power to leverage. I think we really do have to deal with that and speak about that honestly, because for the past decade, people haven't. So while you hear more talk and more general support for labor unions, their density in the population continues to decline. And at face value, it is certainly true that the contract was a victory. As pointed out by union officials, quote, workers gained more in this tentative agreement than over the last 40 years. But given the nearly continuous undercutting of real wages, the rollback of workers' protections, and the vicious increases in the cost of necessities like food and housing that have occurred over the same 4 decades, any contract that doesn't completely capitulate to the company, as the widely reviled 2018 contract did, can be deemed historic in the same terms. I see this too all the time. What's worse, in hailing mannered gains like this, the progressive press made it appear that either uninformed or outright delusional to the suffering under these labor regimes. I see the similar thing in the public sector unions and the teachers union, where in Utah between 2019 and 2022, we got a lot of starting salary gains. But if you looked at where they were, in the middle of, I think, like 2015, people started in Utah as a teacher making $35,000 an hour. $35,000 a year. Somewhere around in there in most districts. And that jumped up to about 60 to 70, depending on where you're at. But if you actually look at the inflation rates, you basically just caught up to the inflation between 2007 and 2020. So really all you did was go back to treading water instead of drowning. And that was historic. What's worse, inhaling major gains like this, the progressive press makes it appear either uninformed or outright delusional to those suffering under the labor regimes. Yep, it does, and it makes me mad when they do it. On the ground, this victory felt more like someone who was getting beaten to a bloody pulp, finally getting thrown back one weak punch at their attacker. Anyone watching could only cringe at the weak attempt, knowing that the flurry of violence that was about to be released in response to even a meager act of defense. The real question is, therefore, the opposite. With the old union bureaucracy ousted, the most pro-labor president since FDR in power, that was Joe Biden, and while that may be true, I actually don't think that was true. I think Johnson was more pro-labor, but whatever. That's a subjective point anyway. In a massive surge in support of unions spanning the political spectrum, why was one of the largest strike threats in recent history able to secure only a moderate raise, returning the majority of the company's employees to barely scraping by poverty wages, which were then almost entirely wiped out by the effects of inflation? In other words, why is poverty seen as the reasonable immediate goal to be fought for, and if won, declared a major victory? Ouch. The simple answer is that the $20 still buys more hamburgers than 16, the last contract's lowest starting wage after tax, and certainly more than the horrific national minimum of $7.25 an hour, which will not even purchase a burger and a half at current prices. In my market, it'll purchase a burger. Supporters of these conservative contracts will always appeal to their ability to compromise, negotiate, and win the reasonable and real gains for the workers. Similarly, any intent to vote down such contracts is portrayed as unrealistic or even breaching the implicit agreement for both sides to bargain in good faith, aka bargain non-oppositionally. That's me feeling that in, but that's what it means. By encouraging further militance amongst the workers, campaigns tend to extend or intensify strike actions, may even threaten the union with legal repercussions. Yep. The NCLB is not actually your friend. This administrative ethic, intrinsic to the basic institutional structure of modern labor relations, therefore serves to suppress any independent partisan forms of organization that might otherwise gestate within the workplace. For example, over the decade ago, as a fast food worker in Seattle, I helped organize a series of walkouts led by the SEIU, aimed at winning a new minimum wage of $15 an hour. While many of the fast food workers who participated hoped that this was the beginning of a citywide unionization drive, they were instead gradually ejected from any decision-making roles within the movement, which it soon became clear was essentially a PR stunt for a series of electoral campaigns led by the city's establishment alliance of business, government, and labor interests. Subsistence struggles. Hold the burger in front of your face and stare at its glistening meat for long enough, and you will see the contradictions revealed. As the immediate means of our survival, the burger is a natural starting point of class conflict. All struggles begin in one way or another as struggles over the terms of subsistence, and fights for increased wages, for lower costs of necessities like housing and healthcare, for adequate support for enormous and rapidly increasing portion of the U.S. population unable to work due to often work-induced disability. There's more of that. There's the men's project stuff that I have talked about in the past really illustrates how bad this has gotten. For the elimination of onerous debt burdens, or quite literally for the mere ability to live without fear of being murdered by the police. Struggle begins with survival. Who's the most killed faction in the United States? Homeless people with mental illness. It's just a fact, man. Limited to survival, however, it ceases to be a struggle at all and instead becomes something more like administration. After all, the easiest way to secure real gains for working Americans is to collaborate with companies themselves and with the relevant political elites to negotiate marginal victories, winning moderate but material kickbacks for a minority of workers in particular sectors or particular locales. This is exactly what happened in Seattle, where the victory of a minimum wage campaign, itself a laughable 11-year plan to reach $18 by the year 2025, was buoyed by the money flowing through the city's tech, logistics, and real estate industries, and notably did not extend to the sprawling logistics complex in the inter-ring suburbs, where most low-wage workers had since been forced to flee rising rents. And that's happening here in Utah, too. Politically, the function of the real gains is not even to benefit the workers so much as to prevent subsistence struggles from getting out of hand. That's what it always was going to do. But taking truly antagonistic character and thereby triggering legal action against the union, or leading to even more extreme state repression, are just worse laws. See Colorado or what's going on in the South right now. The structural trend in the economy as a whole is to ensure the space that even those moderate victories is shrinking, since the most lucrative gains have historically always been secured as a share of generally rising growth rates. Large manufacturing industries selling to external markets are allowed wage increases to be linked to productivity growth in the post-war compact between business and labor, and such gains for the working class could be won without constraining even larger massive profits accrued to the ruling class. Monopoly power and all that. In other words, even those gains were often won through aggressive tactics such as massive sit-down strikes and major riots in factory districts. The compact itself was ultimately non-antagonistic towards the underlying class system. And for this reason, at the global scale, substantial increases in wages tend to be tracked to periods of rapid growth in industry, and wage stagnation tends to emerge in an economy with the initial growth boom in manufacturing dries up and deindustrialization sets in. Now, I've talked about the different kinds of deindustrialization before. I talked about it particularly behind the Patreon wall. There's three things that you can mean by deindustrialization, which is one, less people working in industry. That's undoubtedly true worldwide, not just in the developed world, although it's most severe there. Less GDP from industry. That's kind of true, but not really. GDP in industrial production is still pretty high. Are less industrial production overall, which is false. We produce more than we did in the 50s, even in the US, but it doesn't scale to jobs, which makes certain political talking points today just economically illiterate. After this point, even if an industrial output remains high in absolute terms, employment is shed from the industry and evenly split between two increasingly distinct labor markets. The majority of low-wage, largely localized service occupations and a minority of high-wage occupations in the largely international producer services are within lead firms at the cutting edge of technological innovation, and AI is drying that up. So good luck with that. As a result, the geography of intense workplace struggle, and particularly workplace struggle followed by economy-wide wage increases, has clearly flowed waves of industrialization. Pulse of wage growth, therefore, followed the position of new industrial territories across the world, from the heyday of industrial unionism in the US in the mid-20th century to places like Japan and Italy in post-war period, then to the entire series of newly industrialized countries that emerged across East and Southeast Asia in the last half of the decade. After the turn of the millennium, the trend reached China, where strikes, riots, blockades, and even factory occupations became increasingly concentrated in a few Sunbelt industrial centers. In each case, the industrial action were followed by rising wages and then waves of mechanization and offshoring. Bing, 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 bing. More the mechanization than the offshoring, but they both happen a lot. Today, employment in China slowly deindustrializes as a matter of state policy. The same trend emerges in new manufacturing complexes like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, where there's no state policy slowing it down. I'm adding that, but it's true. Through none of this in the case of subsistence struggles, subsequently decline elsewhere. The expulsion of most of the labor force out of manufacturing sector has tended to break the link between the workplace organizing, the rise in the labor share of income enabled by rapid productivity growth. On one hand, subsistence struggles proliferate elsewhere, in reproductive sectors, among tenants, in new labor campaigns, among relatively atomized service workers like Starbucks, and of course, as riotous uprisings that target the endpoint of circularization, the communization love of riots. Talk about that another time. I've already done a show with Daniel Todd on his channel about it. On the other, victories become more limited because the space for something like a new version of the post-war compact has narrowed. Given the cost disease suffered by low productivity services, high wages can no longer form a virtuous cycle with the general economic growth in the deindustrialized economies. Thus, any substantial or economic-wide gains won for the workers will increasingly come at the direct expense of the ruling class. Subsistence struggles, therefore, take on a sharper curve, passing more quickly from non-antagonistic compromises with those empowered to antagonistic threats against them. Thus, a return to something like a 19th century economy that liberals just frankly can't deal with. Already, the concrete gains available to subsistence structures have tended to be geographically concentrated in a few areas where administrative core of accumulation are located. New York, Seattle, all of California. And the excess of value spelling out from this global process of appropriation visible concentration of higher paying STEM and fire jobs and spill over into the real estate construction, etc., all contributing to substantially larger local tax base that then enables cities like Austin, for example, to institute a living wage of $21.63 an hour for municipal employees, while big cities in the same state like Houston struggle at $15 an hour. We have municipal employees in Salt Lake that make like 10, and I'm not joking about that. All right. Meanwhile, areas further out are treated as sacrifice zones for the deadliest and dirtiest industries, particularly in places like, I don't know, Texas. Not to mention the vast and growing disasters associated with ongoing environmental collapse. Populations subjected to the latter then generate chaotic new forms of feedback via the great displacement of populations currently underway both within the U.S. and globally, where migrant crisis serves as a cutting edge of the knife currently dividing the world into different grades of habitability. These new forms of simultaneously inter and intra-national spatial inequality, this, the rational core of world system theory, both applied outside and within the US, are precisely what economic geographers have been documented for years. As I argued in 2014 in the wake of the $15 an hour campaign in Seattle, long quote of Phil Neel quoting himself from a decade ago. Because of this placement near the top of the global supply chain, Seattle can, in fact, afford a broader social contract so long as it is geographically confined. The result will be continuing geographic concentration of wealth paired with the creation of selected bubbles of social democracy to help buffle these wealthy cores from the true severity of the gap between rich and poor. Just go to outside of Mobile, Alabama, and tell me what you see if you don't believe me, or Phil, on this. Social democracy on this miniature scale will be constructed as a revival of progressive populist and socialist parties, DSA, an increased role for the most entrepreneurial business unions like the SEIU, and a continuing growth in the most robust philanthropic capitalist network of social service NGOs who are now been guided by Trump's actions. So maybe that's not as true anymore. I would like to see what Phil thinks about this post-Doge. And this is precisely what occurred over the subsequent years as some of the richest municipalities and states raised their minimum wage, implemented by local versions of semi-socialized healthcare for the poor, see California, legalized marijuana, see like everywhere, but like Idaho and maybe Texas now, and Kansas, I think, decriminalized psychedelics, that was mainly a West Coast thing, and passed a raft of other progressive social programs, but ones that don't affect very much. However, since the measures were often solely enabled through an alliance with local tech, real estate, and finance interests, they did nothing to actually solve the underlying cost of living crises that they were ostensibly responding to, particularly on the West Coast and East Coast. Now, as the basis of this tenuous compromise begins to fracture, see who showed up at the Trump inauguration, it is likely that the space for these local compromises will narrow further, and the geographic divergence will currently underway will intensify. Meanwhile, the areas out of this narrowing compact have already seen their healthcare system stripped down to blood-soaked bones, their remaining social services sold for scraps, child labor re-legalized, environmental protections nullified, and increased militarized form of surveillance and social control deployed against their local populations. We're going to stop here and finish this next round. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. And if you want to hear more like this, subscribe to Varn blog for as little as $4 a month. You too can get all the audio, including audio I don't release to the public. There's not a ton of it. And also you get my back archives of every podcast I've ever done that I have access to anyway. You can find that and more. But, also go read the Brooklyn Rail. Do what you need to do. Protect your peace.